2,000 cases.
Mary appearing,
messages,
19th century,
end of the world,
divine
psychology,
spirituality,
lady of light,
purest secrets,
supernatural
prayer,
Medjugorje,
miracles, peace,
phenomena,
extraordinary
cash,
Lourdes,
prophecy,
Guadalupe,
conspiracy,
Fatima,
apocalypse,
Christianity,
Marian Apparitions. Without doubt, Mary is the most common figure who appears in these apparitions, sometimes in dreams, but quite often in particular places at particular times. But the form of the apparition, precisely what goes on, what people experience, where, when, has changed through the centuries. Since 1930, when one specialist in the field thinks there have been about 2,000 cases of people claiming that Mary has appeared to them. The first recorded event that we have of Mary appearing to somebody, the first one that we know about, is in a dream which somebody had about the year 230. So we're talking here about something which has gone over on for a period of almost 2,000 years. Now, why that happens, I don't know. But what you can say is that I would say probably hundreds of thousands of people have experienced Mary's presence and sometimes Mary's messages to them in some way or another. When Mary appears to people, sometimes people don't actually see many details. Sometimes it's almost like just a lady of light or a ball of light in some cases. Sometimes it's actually very precise. Catherine Labouré, when Mary appeared to her, actually heard Mary's silk dress rustling. So it was a very specific thing in some ways. But when Mary speaks, which is not always, it's always in the local language. In the Middle Ages, I'd say there's almost a standard form of Mary's apparitions, and it's quite often not exactly her, but it's something connected with her, quite often to do with a statue or maybe a particular church. And the average person who gets an apparition, who claims that they see Mary in the Middle Ages, is somebody who is a royal person, or an aristocrat, or quite frequently a monk or a nun. That changed, it began to change in about the 16th century, and it's certainly the 19th century, which some people call the century of Mary. Things changed rapidly there during that period. Now, clearly there's a kind of a connection between psychology and spirituality. This area is an area where it's very difficult to talk with a great deal of certainty about this is definitely happening, this is definitely not happening. How much of this is imagination? How much of this is God speaking? How much of this is psychology? It's quite difficult for those to work out. So the Church, the Roman Catholic Church, has been very wary about making any official statement about whether these things are true or not. And in a way, who can tell what's going on in each individual human soul and each individual mind? You just don't have access to the secrets. So even to define what an apparition is really quite difficult. If I see Mary, does it mean that everybody else sees her? Clearly not. We have many documented cases where people, the visionaries or the seers, are experiencing some kind of trance or some vision of Mary, and nobody else knows what's going on. But because it's possible for people to get very, I want to say, seduced by this in some ways. I mean, it's if you think of yourself as having a vision of Mary, you experience that, or of anybody for us, it could be easy to think of yourself as being a very special person. So it could be kind of a big ego trip in some way. So the Church is always very careful. But there have been cases when the Church has said, no, you know what? This is not supernatural. This is just people's psychology working. God is not present. One of the ways in which the Church has been able to decide this is actually the content of the message. And particularly in the 19th century, many Marian apparitions of Mary, suddenly started talking about the end of the world, what would happen. And some of them talked about kind of a divine punishment for people's wickedness. In the early 1980s, a group of young people in a small place called Medjugorje in Croatia began receiving visions of the Virgin Mary. Now, nobody else could see these things. They were a group of people in their late teens, early 20s, who just looked at a wall where apparently Mary was appearing, and they'd fix on that and go into trance, and Mary was speaking to them. But it's a good example of how complex and how difficult it is to try and understand what's going on here. Not surprisingly, Mary gave messages. And she revealed herself as being Queen of Peace, and what she asked for typically, apparently, in the messages, which they relayed to the people who went there, was quite often the typical Marian messages, which are repentance, more prayer, some consoling messages, and then some messages which perhaps are a little more threatening. So then we have what those young people themselves experienced. Now that's one thing. But there's a whole other side of the coin, is that more than 2 million people have gone to that place. Many of those people who have gone there have experienced extraordinary events. They talk about their rosaries turning gold in their hands, and they talk about looking at the sun and the sun dancing or spinning. And there are accounts of this where people are claiming that they've seen it, and one person will see it and another person will not. Now, part of that, I think what's going on is that some people are more psychologically conditioned in wanting them. That's, if you go there expecting to see a miracle, you're more likely to see one. Now, the Catholic Church has got a process for investigating things like this, and the first person who investigates is the local bishop. And if the local bishop says, this is not supernatural, the whole thing stops there, and people are, let's say, are discouraged from going there. That's exactly what happened. However, the visitors kept on coming. And what happened there in that case was the Vatican opened up the investigation again. I think partly because there was so much pressure. Where the status quo is with this situation now is that it seems to have kind of calmed down in some ways. It's certainly the war in Croatia knocked it on the head tremendously. But there is a history in Marian apparitions that there are very, very few places of Marian apparitions where there's a long tradition of people going there. Initially, what happens is we have the event itself, and the place where that happens turns into a kind of a shrine or a place where people go on pilgrimages, where there were hundreds of thousands of people went to these places of apparitions where Mary had talked to young shepherds and young children. Only one of those remains as a popular place, which is Lourdes. What you have in Lourdes is the experience of somebody, a young Bernadette Soubirous, who saw the Virgin Mary perhaps 18, 19 times, and who actually suffered for it in many ways. There are a number of things typically that people do there in Lourdes, and these are in response to the things that Mary said to Bernadette herself. A spring sprung up there in Lourdes, and it now produces hundreds of thousands of gallons of water per year. What people do with that is that there are public taps, and they'll go and drink that water, or they'll wash their face in it. Mary asked that a church should be built there, and there are now, maybe like 4 or 5 immense churches in the sanctuary of Lourdes. In Lourdes, the sick, the handicapped, are the first-class citizens. They get the best treatment. They go first. They go right to the front of the line. And there is a sense in which, this is what the church should be about, which is giving priority to the people who most need care. In her messages to Bernadette, Mary never said anything about miracles. But very quickly, when the news spread that this young girl was receiving visions of the Virgin Mary who was speaking to her, people started turning up. The local authorities in Lourdes were kind of embarrassed about this, and they wanted to clamp down on it. They thought it was primitive and it was just part of something that they didn't want Lourdes to be known for. But pretty soon after the apparitions, there were news of miraculous healings there. So one of the things that Lourdes has become famous for is miracles. Now, I've never actually seen a miracle take place. The last officially recognized miracle happened in 1981, so it's a long time since that happened. But I think, in a way, going to those places which are, let's say, holy places, you do get touched by the holy in some ways. And I want to say that there are miracles which are perhaps daily miracles that perhaps you don't recognize as such. And something will change inside, even if it's just a recognition that actually, you may complain a lot about things, but compared with some people, you're pretty well off. That in itself is a minor miracle. So one of the things that happens with Marian apparitions is that the place where Mary has been tends to turn into a holy place. One of the phenomena that happens with Marian apparitions are apparitions which are, let's say, semi-natural in some ways. Now, you might have heard about the eBay event when somebody had a piece of cheese which was supposed to look like Mary, and then it got sold up to somebody who lived in Vegas for a large amount of money. There's a recent one of a piece of chocolate melting, and when it melted, it froze again into its shape, which actually looked like Mary. In the subway system in Manila, one of the pipes leaked on the floor, and the stain some people said, looked like Mary. And immediately it turned into a shrine. People bought candles there, they bought flowers there, and people started praying there. So this is a kind of an instinct, I think, they have, that Mary is somehow very close to people. And it attracts people. Eventually what they had to do was to dig up the paving and actually put it in a separate chapel, because people couldn't use the subway because of this. A similar thing happened when a kind of a shape which looked a bit, I'll draw it for you with my finger, it kind of looks like that. And it's a stain or a mark which appeared on a window of an office building in Houston. Again, people said, this is Mary. Well, who's to say it isn't, and who's to say it is? But I think there's a significant difference between those, what we could call perhaps semi-natural apparitions, where the image of Mary appears, or something which possibly looks like what we typically think of Mary looking, and one of the major apparition sites. In this hemisphere, in the Americas, clearly the most important apparition and the apparition site is Guadalupe in Mexico. In the early 16th century, Mary appears to Juan Diego, who is a Nahua. He's an indigenous person from the people who have been conquered by the Spaniards. The first written account of that comes about 100 years later, and it is from that written account that we get the familiar details which some people may know about how Mary appears to Juan Diego. She tells him to carry a message to the local bishop about building a church. The bishop doesn't believe him. This goes on 3 times, and then the bishop asks for a sign. The sign is that he wants roses, and it's the wrong season for roses, and he wants roses from Spain. Mary makes these happen. Juan Diego gathers them in his cloak and takes the cloak and lets the roses fall in front of the bishop, and then miraculously imprinted on the cloak is the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe. And that is what people venerate today in the Basilica of Guadalupe, just outside Mexico City. Now, from that one event has become a whole, I want to say, a world. I mean, Mexico, people will say, is actually born at that moment. So Mary and a Marian apparition becomes a symbol of a whole nation at that point. It's very difficult for people to understand the difference between Mexico and Guadalupe. When Mexico becomes independent, the War of Independence, they carry the flag of Guadalupe into battle. And so what I want to say here is that we get an idea here how important these things can be, and precisely how passionate people feel about this, that their identity, how they think about themselves, is deeply, deeply woven in with their devotion towards Mary. The story of Fatima is one of a Marian apparition which has, let's say, grown with time. It goes back to the year 1917. It's the year which was the most bloody year of the First World War. In Portugal, at the time, there is a government which is really quite anti-religious, and Mary appears to 3 young children. Within 2 years, 2 of those children are dead. But it's the one who doesn't die, Sister Lucia, who really pushes the thing along. I say Sister Lucia because she becomes a nun later on. She dies at the age of 95 in a convent in Portugal. Lucia told the story of the apparitions several times. There are at least 4 written accounts of the apparitions. And each one of them gets a little more elaborate than the next one. Certainly, when Fatima happened, the story got out very, very quickly because Mary is supposed to have given 3 secrets. And the 3rd secret has always been the problematical one in Fatima. By the time of the last apparition, 70,000 people turned up in this place in Fatima, little obscure rural village in Portugal, and saw what we refer to as the miracle of the sun dancing. It's a similar thing to what happened in Medjugorje. Now, can 70,000 people get the same religious experience? Is it possible to deceive 70,000 people? The first 2 secrets Lucia revealed, and one of them was a vision of hell. This is what Mary showed her and the 2 young friends. The second one was a promise of how it was possible to get people out of hell and how to save the world, which is that the world had to be consecrated to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. The 3rd secret is what has always been a little bit problematical, because in one of her accounts, and she was already a nun at this point, Lucia says that really what was required was there was a prophecy, if you want, of communism, and that Russia would be converted back to Christianity if the world was consecrated to the Immaculate Heart of Jesus. But there is a content of the 3rd secret, a part of the secret, which has never really been completely revealed. She wrote it down and she sent the secret to the Vatican. There are all sorts of conspiracy theories about the content of the 3rd secret of Fatima. One theory is that it foretells the assassination attempt on John Paul II. The Pope who read the actual secret that Lucy had written down is reputedly supposed to have fainted when he read the content. The man who is now our current Pope, who then was Cardinal Ratzinger, and John Paul II both knew the content of the secret. Cardinal Ratzinger, as he was then, said that everything which is in the 3rd secret of Fatima is the same as you will find in the book of Revelation, which is the book of the Apocalypse. So it's to do supposedly with the end of time, possibility of dire punishment, and so forth. Nobody knows quite whether the secrets have been released or not, whether it's something minor or whether it's something totally fantastical or not. What is distinctly true, however, is that Fatima has drawn millions and continues to draw millions of people to there. And it's a message, I want to say, of perhaps of conversion in some way. When people go to these places where visions have taken place, they quite often feel touched. Now, if people can go to those places, whether Mary appears to them or not, if they come away being more tolerant, more loving, more generous, more aware of the poor, more aware of injustice in the world and committing themselves to do something about that, that's a good thing. If they come away and they continue to be selfish, or they get more selfish, then clearly God is not behind that. So what I'm trying to say here is, although these things are fascinating, I'm not entirely sure that they're that important. Because the revelation that happens in these places, the messages of Mary, can only ever be the same message as the message of Jesus Christ. Self-sacrifice, transformation, resurrection. Anything which goes against that is not going to be from God. So we have to look at the after effects of these things. That's where it comes. It's not the first experience, but it's the effect that it leaves in the person afterwards.